Welcome. I'm Melva Persico. Come with me, meet new people, and share their experiences in this episode of Our Culture to the World. My guest today is Alim Hosein, and I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, Alim, please.
Thank you very much, Melva. A good day, good morning, good evening, good night to everyone, wherever you may be. And Melva, thanks for having me on your program. I am basically a lecturer at the University of Guyana. That's where I lecture in linguistics. But my other interests are in art and culture and literature. I have lectured, I've taught in all of those subjects at the university. Right now, my teaching load is in linguistics. I have been writing in the Stabroek News for many years, periodically, on art in Guyana. I've been part of the Castellani board. I've been chair of the board of Castellani House, which is the National Art Museum. And I'm also the chair coordinator of the Guyana Visual Arts Competition, which is the largest art competition in Guyana. It's kind of suspended now because of the COVID, but we have been running since about 2012. It's a biannual competition every 2 years. I've also been on the Guyana Prize for Literature committee, and that is kind of suspended now. But I've been on that committee. I've been involved in cultural activities, planning for Mashramani, Inter-Guyana's festivals, and so on. So my love is for culture generally, and in particular Guyanese culture. I have a personal but non-professional interest in Georgetown history, Guyanese history, which feeds into my work in linguistics, in Creole linguistics, and so on. So history, art, culture, literature, language, all of those things, that's my world.
Yes.
That's my word.
Yes, thank you. Yes, you're really well into the very much into those aspects of culture. And
yes,
as a linguist, I know you mentioned, language is very much an integral part of culture. And we're going to talk about the linguistic situation in Guyana. When I tend to, introduce myself as a Guyanese, and then some people may say, oh, I don't know where Guyana is. I'm saying, okay, it's in the northeast of South America, and it's the only English-speaking country in South America. But tell us about the linguistic situation in Guyana.
Okay, that's a very interesting situation. As you said, it is known to be the only English-speaking country in South America. Of course, there's Belize, further into Central America. But we have that identity because of our long British colonial occupation from about the early part of the 1800s, 1813, around then. And English then has become the official language of Guyana. And so we go by that kind of identification. But the true language of Guyana is the Creole language, which I speak, and I'm sure you can speak, and many other Guyanese can speak. Even when they go abroad and they live for many years, it's baked into them, it's part of their DNA. So the Creole language, and we could talk a little bit more on the history of that Creole language, which has an English lexicon.
Mm-hmm.
And because it has an English lexicon, it also seems to make it appear that we're an English-speaking country. But the Creole, of course, has many differences from English that might make it difficult for a British standardized English speaker to understand. So most of you can generally say that the country speaks a Creole, which has an English lexicon. But of course, there are other languages. We have the indigenous languages, the languages of the indigenous people, many of which sadly have been lost or eroded or are endangered.
Mm-hmm.
Makushi, the university was doing some work in reviving Makushi and so on. We have the language of people coming into Guyana. We had a large influx of Brazilians a few years ago. So we have Brazilian Portuguese, we have Haitian French, we have Chinese, persons from China, especially the mainland, coming to set up businesses in Guyana. So we have some Chinese. And of course, now with the oil exploration, we have more Americans coming in. So we have an Americanized English. So we have a number of languages in Guyana. Guyana is a very multilingual country. Of course, some of these other languages like French and Brazilian are not widely spoken, but they do have a presence in Guyana. In Guyana, there's increasing language awareness. Persons are, I think, becoming more confident in being Guyanese and confident about Guyanese culture and Guyanese language. There's a strengthening through the work done at the university and in the high schools of interest and understanding of Guyanese Creole. And of course, there are the new language influences that are coming in. And of course, there's always been the general long-term influence of English as an international language that we're exposed to through the television, radio, internet, books, magazines, and other forms of international communication. So it's a very complex situation. You have the different ethnic groups, in the Creole, some persons would claim that you have an Afro-Guyanese English and a Creole and an Indo-Guyanese Creole, and the Amerindians speak differently from both of these groups, and so on. So we have the change of the Creole as you have the different levels of the Creole from the basilectal Creole, the real authentic Creole. Well, I should say authentic, I should say the historically foundational Creole, the basilect, and other versions, other forms that have developed over the years. So even in the Creole itself, you have lots of variations. So it's a very complex linguistic situation in Guyana.
Yes, one thing I know you didn't mention, and I've noticed that recently in Guyana too, is Spanish, because we have a lot of, I noticed, we have a lot of Cubans now who come to Guyana to do business and so on. And so I hear a lot of Spanish in Guyana now too. Mm-hmm.
Well, we have a lot of Venezuelan miners in the hinterland. Mm-hmm. And you are quite right that recently we've had a spate of arrivals from Cuba. Mm-hmm. And so we have that as being part of our language also. And in the past, we've had people like persons from the French Caribbean islands who were living in Madia. Mm-hmm. And Professor Ian Robertson had found a kind of French Guyanese Creole in Madia, which they call Gainawala. I don't know if it's still spoken there. I think it were persons from the French Caribbean islands had come to work as miners in Madia.
Oh, what that was during which period? In what period?
This was in the 1980s, 60s, 70s, and probably around the 1980s it started to be more reduced. Mm-hmm. They would have the French Caribbean festival, like the La Rose Festival and so on, used to be held in Madia.
Oh yeah, I think I heard of that. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You talked about the different, the Creole continuum. You mentioned the Basilec. So maybe if we could just talk a little bit about that, because, we know that there's some people who, like I would think, okay, the people maybe in West Coast Berbice, they might speak a different form of Creole from those of us, like me. I grew up in Linden, but then I lived most of my adult life in Georgetown. And our Creole is different from people maybe in Quarantine or West Coast Berbice. So could you explain a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, the Creole language that we speak has variations like any other language. All languages have variations and varieties. Some of these variations might be regional variations, like persons in different parts of the country, as you mentioned, might speak differently from other persons in other parts of the country, even though they speak in the same language. So like you have, for example, you have the dialects of English, you have like Yorkshire English, you have South London dialect, and Southern English dialect, Northern English, and so on, with the different counties of England. Now, the variations in our Creole could probably arise from two different ways. One, so yes, on the plantations, persons might have different kinds of contact with another language because of their occupation. You had the field workers, you had the technical workers, the skilled workers, the coopers, the carpenters, saddle makers, and so on. You had the grooms looking after the horses, you had people working within the great houses, and so on. So you'd have different kinds of contact with English in our case. And so they might have had different levels of acquisition of English or forms of Creole closer to English and further away from English. You also have the historical factor where the first set of persons to acquire a language would probably acquire it in a more basic way than the second generation who will come in, and the third generation will come in, and the fourth generation who will come in, right? And then, of course, remember, it's each generation passing the language down to the other generation. And there's change going on as the generations go by. So that might be another reason. A third reason might be because of persons now after slavery, persons, and even after emancipation, persons diversifying their occupations. And as a society developed and became more like a country than a plantation, the Africans went to work as civil servants, as lawyers, doctors, teachers, market vendors, and different kinds of self-employed people and so on. And so for those reasons, they had to pursue the learning of English in a more vigorous manner. And so they probably acquired versions of English that are closer to English than the persons who remained on the fields. Remember too, you had the village movement in Guyana in the 1800s, where after the purchase, after about 4 years after emancipation, so about 1838, 1840s, they were able to purchase the plantations like Victoria and so on. And so Africans remained on the plantations. And so probably a more basilectal Creole prospered in that setting, whereas others moved to Georgetown and became civil servants and teachers and so on. And so they had a closer contact and probably had to function more in English than in Creole, even while they kept the Creole, but they had to function more in English. So for several reasons, you could have variations. Another reason would be because even though the Creole had developed, remember we still were a colony of England up to 1966. And we had English civil servants, we had an English governor, we had broadcasts from the BBC, the books were coming from England, newspapers and radio and all of those things from England. So because we maintained contact with English, right? And also because we saw the value of learning English because it helped us to become economically better. You get a better job if you were speaking English and if you were wearing a suit and tie, you know. So English offered us opportunities. Yes. And so our foreparents found ways of incorporating English into their language as best as they could. From what they would learn from the models that they have of English. And so instead of having one defined Creole, which is what we call the basilect, we have the mesolect and we have the acrolect, which are versions, the acrolect being the ones that seem to be closer to English. And the mesolect, the versions that seem to be between English and basilect. But you know, there are researchers like Keane Gibson and Rickford and Robertson and so on. And me too. We would say that, you know, it's basically what you have is 2 levels rather than 3. Because a mesolect is like a version of the basilect with different vocabulary, right? And some differences in grammar. And we we recognize the value of the Basilic as the foundational kind of Creole, right? Some in Guyanese, we call it the raw Creole or the real Creole or the basic Creole.
Right.
Okay? But
Right.
the whole thing, Creole language with different varieties.
Right. Because it's like with the Basilic, I would say, you might hear somebody say, la we go. But whereas, like I would say, let we go.
There we go. Correct.
More, yeah, you know.
Yeah. So the Creole fits in well with sociolinguistic factors. So we know when we say I'm going, and may I go, we know how to say those things.
Right.
Right. And so within our own family and people and friends and so on, we can talk, we can speak the Creole. Like you see right now, I just was going to say talk, I'm talking to you. Mm-hmm. And I was going to use the word talk instead of speak. Right? Now people might say, oh, he is talking English. But an Englishman wouldn't say he is talking English. We say, I am speaking English.
Right.
So we have some subtle variations between English and Creole. And in speaking to you, I would know now to speak for the public program, I would say speak. But in speaking to you, let us say if we meet in the streets, I may say talk. Mm-hmm. I'm talking to you. Yeah. And then with my closer friends, I might say, okay, le abe giaf. Well, abe giaf here, you know, abe giaf with Mati, abe giaf with one another, and so on. So the Creole is there because it is intertwined and interwoven into the Guyanese social fabric, into our relationships, into the things that we do, into the respect that we give to people. When you talk to your family, you say, what are you doing? That's a mark of respect to them. Instead of saying, what are you doing? If you say to your daughter or your husband or your wife, what are you doing? It seems as though you're scolding them, right? If you say, what are you doing? You know, they know that you see them doing something, but you're talking to them on a level. Mm-hmm. You're not jumping on a high horse and implying that you're condemning them and so on. Mm-hmm. So the pragmatics, the sociolinguistics, the culture of the Creole, it's all wrapped up in Guyanese speakers in our life. We can't separate the two.
Yes, but you know, when you say that, it makes me, you know, like when we were growing up, you know, at least our parents, we would be talking Creolese among ourselves and with our friends and so on. But, you know, they would want to say that, speak properly, you know? Now tell me about that, because even recently I saw there's this Guyanese group on Facebook, and there was this big debate about Creolese and what's not. And, you know, and talking about broken English and whether it's a language or whether it's not a language and so on. So maybe we could talk about that, about, you know, is it, we as linguists, we know that it's a language, but how could we educate the rest of the public? And how could, and why is it that we have this stigma against Creolese and feel that it's not a language, and that if you're speaking it, you're not speaking properly?
Properly, correct. That's a very important point, and that's what we try to get across to our students. Now, there are always attitudes to language, and I see attitudes as being like a double-edged kind of sword. A negative attitude to a language and a positive attitude to another language. Now, part of the problem is imperialism, cultural imperialism, because at the bottom of it all, Guyana is a country that started as a place where Europeans came to settle. But even before that, we had the Amerindians, the indigenous people, who were here, and they had integrated into the land, and they had learned the ways of the land, and they had their cultures and civilizations and so on, and they lived. But Guyana developed into a certain direction because of the arrival of Europeans who came with a different kind of technology and a different kind of culture. And further, they brought other people into this picture. And the Amerindians got marginalized. And the other people who came, they came not as equals to the Europeans, but they came as workers for the Europeans. And so the indigenous people got marginalized. The people that they brought, the Africans and the East Indians and Chinese and Portuguese, came as workers. And so we were left with that kind of servant mentality, second-class mentality, that even though right now, even up to now, some people say Guyana is not a real country.
Well, but you know that trend, that trends on social media. Guyana is not a real place.
Guyana is not a real place. Because we haven't, you see, it's not as though a set of people came together 10,000 years ago and worked things out and planned things out and evolved a culture. It was that we were brought here, the land was marked up, we were put in plantations, you know, we imitated dress and so on and so on and so on and so on. So, and then we were indoctrinated because now Guyana became a place from which the British, the Dutch first of all, and then the British extracted wealth. They were not interested in developing the country. They were interested in getting the sugar, the rice, the timber, the bauxite, the cocoa,
gold, or whatever.
Gold,
yeah,
of course. And now you see all of those things. So we were really like a plantation, so a plantation economy. And then around 1966, you know, when we tried to fight for our freedom, we were repressed until they found that they couldn't hold us anymore. And so they said, okay, go ahead and have your independence. So that bred within us a culture of inferiority, a culture of second-classness, a culture that reality is somewhere else.
Right, exactly. So that the British language, that is the standard, and that is what
the language is standard.
That is the real thing.
The way of dress, the way of the relationships, the language, the foods, you know, the systems of parliament, the good study manufacture. Some people still, you know, say, you had the British cars, you know, you had the Austin and the Morris Oxford cars, you know.
Real good, strong cars.
British steel, right, that kind of thing, you know. And so we imbibe a positive attitude to English and a negative attitude towards our Creole. And then the linguists of the time, the persons who were studying at the time, they saw Creole languages as broken, bastardized languages. And they said, you know, let us say like in the 1700s, the 1800s, they said it is scientifically proven that the Africans have a certain kind of physical appearance that prevents them from articulating words properly, right? And they say that the Amerindians now, they don't have a real culture. They live in the bush, so they don't know anything. The East Indians, when the East Indians came with their dhoti and so on, they became the lower class, right? With their different language and, you know, our dark skins and so on. So everything they had a way of saying, this equals nothing good. This equals nothing good. This equals nothing good. Our gods, our religions were not respected. The Hindu marriage rights were not respected. You only got married when you go officially, and a Christian priest or a marriage officer gives you a marriage license. There's nothing like nikah or marrying under the bamboo. If you're married like that, you are not considered to be officially married, right? The Africans, of course, their culture was destroyed. Their family structures, their foods, their ways of life. Obia, for example, was banned. Even though Obia included not superstition and bad things, not evil, but like herbal cures, right? Using the herbs, using the soil, and so on, believing in spiritual powers, and so on. They condemned all of that. They banned it. They criminalized it. And so Obia went underground and became something evil. So language is wrapped up in the same ways. And so therefore, that is why we feel that English and other European languages are the best languages.
Right, superior to,
to our, yeah. And the thing is that Guyanese people will speak the Creole and they will deny that they're speaking the Creole. So when we take our students on field trips and we go and we talk to people and so on. And we talk about what they'll say, nah, me just talk Creole. Me just talk English. And then they say, them people oversaw. Them people that side. Them attack.
Okay. So, okay.
Right? Yes. And we have some stereotypes that people in Berbice talk Creole. Everywhere we go, people tell, oh, no, we don't talk Creole. Please don't talk Creole. You got to go up Berbice.
Yeah, for hear real Creole. Okay.
They're speaking to us in Creole.
And it's exactly.
Yes. But a colleague from Jamaica told me that the same thing happens in Jamaica when they go on their field trips. Right? And they speak to people who are speaking Jamaican Creole. And when they tell the people about that, and the people said, well, we think Mataka all the time. English Mataka to you all the time. Of course, they will speak in the Jamaican way.
Right.
Yeah, we are not alone in that.
But
so we have this attitude to it.
Right. And I remember some friends, they went to, I think it was Rosignol or somewhere, kind of a missionary trip. And they went and they tried, they said, okay, we're going to talk to the people how they speak. So they were speaking in Creole and the people were kind of rejected them, saying, y'all come from Georgetown, how y'all talking? So Georgetown people ain't supposed to talk like that, right? So the people were telling them not to speak.
Correct. Clearly, yes. You see, that's the other side of it too, right? That we have inculcated this belief, this indoctrination so much that, the president has to speak in a particular way to be president. School teachers in school have to speak in a particular manner to be school teachers. You have to speak in the language that people think. Now, even if you say, you go to them and say, well, what happened there? How are you do? And they will say, no, you should, you come from Georgetown. And if you speak to them, well, okay, so how you all doing? They will accept that as English, right? And they will feel better that you're speaking to them in that way. They will accept that as English. So we have inculcated these things. And as I said, we have inculcated the stereotypes that, for example, that East Indian people speak Creole more than African people, that people in Berbice speak Creole, right? That people in Georgetown don't speak Creole, that people in Georgetown speak English, that Mr. Burnham, for example, was the epitome of English, right? That school teachers should speak English in schools. It hampers our education system too, that you're teaching Creole speakers in your classes, especially in primary school, right? But you have to talk to them in English. You demand that they speak to you and write in English when they have a whole experience in Creole.
Right.
That if you speak to them in Creole, they might open up more to you. But when we tell them to write an essay in English and they can't write an essay, we give them an F or a D. But that child probably has many, many ideas, many stories that they can tell you.
Right.
But we want it in an English, what we think is an English manner, English fashion, and so on, right? And if a teacher goes in front of a classroom and say, okay, pick me, here what I'm going to do today. I'm going to learn how to talk story. Now, story got beginning and it got middle and it got end, right? So you start like this, you introduce, you tell Abby who you talk about, like they got one man and he got one daughter. And then you tell Abby what happened. And then you tell Abby, well, now a problem turned up, right? And then you tell Abby how them solve the problem. And how everything done and everybody live happy. If a teacher does that, somebody might complain to the head of department or to the head teacher that this teacher not doing her job properly or his job properly. Not doing what they should. They should be teaching English in the schools. That goes right through our system, our society.
Yeah, but we're gonna just kind of a little aside. One of the good things in a way though that we know, like with the CXC, the English A, the students, when they have to write, let's say if they're writing stories, and so I know they can with dialogue, like if I'm writing a story and I'm saying, okay, you can actually write how the people speak, and so they can include the Creole language in to really how the people actually would express themselves in that language. Yes.
Yeah. But they should be able to write a whole essay in Creole. Not so? Yes, like how the English can write an essay in English and the French can write an essay in French. Well, we have a language called Guyanese Creole. Yes. People do not believe that Creole is a language.
Yes. And, that is something that we could talk a little bit more about that. Before we do that, though, what I noticed, I know some Caribbean countries are really I'm thinking specifically of Belize. And I think they have really done a good job in, and Jamaica too,
Jamaica also,
in promoting their Creole as a language. And so there are lots of, the written form exists, and, you have, literature and so on in the written form of these Creole languages. But let's talk about Guyanese Creole as a language and not as broken English, as some people say.
Exactly. Yeah.
Why can we say that it's a language?